Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank all the Jewish Society and all the other societies involved in inviting me to come here and talk. It's really an honor and a privilege to be allowed to address you. I'm here to tell you about my family's and my experiences during World War II. I am a survivor of that terrible genocide commonly referred to as the Holocaust or the Shoah as well. Now, I always feel a little bit awkward when I describe myself as a survivor because I was born during the war. I was only a toddler age at the end of it. So, of course, I have no direct memories of those times. I did not personally experience the terror that many people older than myself did. And all I can tell you are stories that were told to me by the family or things that I read in some books and in some of my research. But the fact remains, as melodramatic as it sounds, that I was born under a death sentence, because by the time I was born, all Jews in Nazi-held territory had been condemned to death. I am in the literature called a hidden child, but if I had been found, I would certainly have been killed. So in that sense, I am a survivor. Now, you might wonder why I want to talk about such terrible times, and particularly now that they are so long ago. And the fact is, it's not the past that really motivates me or interests me. I feel remembering the past is always important, but my real motivation is the future. Because what I want to talk about is what happens in a society if we allow our prejudices to harden into hatreds and extreme ideologies to flourish. Then I believe we can end up in situations like the Holocaust. Germany, after all, was one of the most advanced societies before the rise of the Nazis. It had produced world-renowned writers and philosophers and musicians and scientists, etc. But none of that prevented, in the end, the rise of the Nazis with their very extreme ideology. And I believe it's only by inoculating ourselves with knowledge of this danger that we can actually be aware of it in our times. So if we want to live in freedom, if we value our own rights to freedom and a decent life, we also have to be vigilant, I believe, for other people's rights as well. Now, the Nazis knew that the ideology, their ideology was very extreme and not accepted in the wider society. They always did their best to hide their game. They spoke in euphemisms, and they tried to fool as well their victims to make it easier for themselves to carry out their actions. Now, at the heart of that ideology was a belief that you could categorize people by race, by blood, and that there were certain races which in their language were so degenerate that they considered it acceptable to kill them. And now, as was mentioned, the Jews were not the only victims of the Nazis. We were the #1 pet hate group, but by no means the only one. There were also a lot of Roma or Gypsy people killed. Jehovah's Witnesses, for some reason, was on the list. Homosexuals, and of course, they started their actual program of killings with their own people, with seriously disabled people. Now, in order to tell you my story, I feel I need to give you a little bit of background about my family and also some background on how we came to be caught up in the nightmare of the Holocaust. Now, we come from a country that doesn't exist now, Czechoslovakia, but this is a map from 1933. And my father was born in 1903 in a small village of Banovce in Slovakia. He was born to a relatively poor family. My grandparents didn't have a lot of money. My grandfather was a clerk in a law office. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. And they had an aspiration for their sons to go to university, something that no one in the family had done before. Now, my father was the eldest of the boys, and he went to the local primary school in this village. But in order to go to university, you needed to go to a secondary school known as a gymnasium, and in order to get into a gymnasium, you had to have Latin. So who better to tutor my father when it came time in Latin than the local Catholic priest, who was Father Joseph Tiso. Now, I mention this seemingly irrelevant little story because Joseph Tiso came to play a prominent role in the history of Slovakia, both before and during the war, and I will come back to him. But my father did go on to university. He studied law, and he went on to become a successful lawyer with his own practice. But his real passion from his youth was the welfare of the Jewish community. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Slovakia, as there was in most of Europe in those days. And my father was very heavily involved in Jewish affairs. At university, he was in leadership positions in Jewish organizations, and it was something that he continued with even when he was working. And in the mid-1930s, this resulted in him actively campaigning during the national elections against a local party in Slovakia, the Slovak People's Party, because the Slovak People Party were advocating greater autonomy for Slovakia within Czechoslovakia. He didn't have an issue with that, but they were echoing very much the same anti-Semitic line of the Nazi Party, and this was the issue for him. And so this led him to crossing paths for the second time with Joseph Tiso, because by this time Tiso was one of the leading officers in the Slovak People's Party. Now let me talk a little bit about my mother. She was born in the city of Moravska Ostrava in what is today the Czech Republic. She was born into a relatively well-off family. My grandparents had an inn and a small restaurant, apparently, and they had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and they aspired to their children going to university. They included the girls, it would seem, because my mother went to the University of Prague to study law, and she was, in fact, in the very first wave of women in that part of the world to become lawyers. So if I say to you that I grew up in a feminist household long before I ever heard the term feminism, you may understand where I'm coming from. She was a very strong-willed and feisty woman. Shortly after she graduated, through some mutual acquaintances, my parents were introduced through someone who knew them both. And the rest, as they say, is history. They were married in 1932, and my sister Ruth was born in 1937. I didn't follow until 1943, but that puts us into the war. So let me step back and talk, as I say, about how it was that we came to be caught up in this nightmare. Now, Hitler, when he came to power in January 1933 in Germany, his first concern was building up his position at home and building up his armed forces, so he made himself eventually fairly quickly the dictator, the Führer. But from the very start, from the outset, he spelled out a vision of a larger Germany that would incorporate all the territory around Germany where there were substantial numbers of German speakers. And so in 1937, when he felt strong enough to begin on his foreign adventures, not surprisingly, his first target was Austria, not only a German-speaking country, but actually the country of his birth, and also where quite a few senior Nazis were born. And he managed a peaceful, at least relatively peaceful, takeover of Austria by early 1938. And he almost promptly, at that point, turned to his second target, which was Czechoslovakia, and specifically an area of Czechoslovakia known as Sudetenland, which is marked in red on this map. Now, the Sudetenland had large numbers of people who were ethnically Germans, Germans who had come through the ages to Czechoslovakia for work. And Hitler demanded of the Czech government that they should cede the Sudetenland to Germany. Now, not surprisingly, the Czech government was not eager to surrender any part of its territory or of its citizens to another power. But being much smaller and weaker than Germany, they looked to their allies, particularly the British and the French, to support them against Hitler. But as we know, in the infamous conference of September 1938 in Munich, the then Prime Minister of this country, Neville Chamberlain, agreed to Hitler's demands, and the French government also agreed to them. And Neville Chamberlain famously, on returning to this country, waved the agreement in the air as he got off the plane, saying, "Peace in our times." But it only showed how little he understood Hitler's intentions. So the Czech government, finding itself without allies, very reluctantly agreed to cede Sudetenland to Germany, and there was a peaceful takeover of that part of Czechoslovakia. The German army marched in. It didn't take long, though, for Hitler to then make his next moves, which were, in fact, two almost simultaneous moves. On the one hand, in the middle of March 1939, he ordered the invasion of the rest of what is today the Czech Republic on some feeble pretext, which I don't even remember, and I don't think most people do. Now, the Czech army, by this stage, was so demoralized by what had happened, and on top of that, the military defenses against Germany, the main defenses were in the hills and mountains of Sudetenland, which had been surrendered to the German army. So there was no resistance at all. There was a peaceful takeover. But as far as Slovakia went, it was a different plan. Hitler invited the head of the Slovak People's Party to come to Germany on the 15th of March. And by this time, the man was Joseph Tiso. And Tiso went to Berlin, and Hitler invited him to declare Slovakia independent. When I say invited, I think a more correct term is probably ordered him. But I don't think Tiso was probably reluctant to do so. So Tiso declared Slovakia independent. And to show you how high up the agenda for the Slovak People's Party, their anti-Semitism was, this was middle of March. He had to go back. They had to form a new government and a new parliament. And already in April 1939, the Slovak parliament started to pass the first of a series of anti-Jewish laws. This legislation echoed very much the laws that had been passed earlier in Germany in the 1930s. So Jews, for example, couldn't practice certain professions. They couldn't be teachers in public schools. They couldn't be lecturers at universities. Jewish people who had businesses couldn't have Aryans working for them. But there were also some very arbitrary or very more bizarre types of issues. Jews had to turn in their sports equipment that they had. They had to turn in their radios. They couldn't ride bicycles. They couldn't go to the cinema. They couldn't go to the public parks. So there was a long list of things like that. But terrible as those laws were, as we know, worse was to come. In March 1942, the Germans announced that they were going to shortly start the deportation of the Jews of Slovakia. And the only thing that they said was that they were taking them to the east, without specifying where in the east, to a new life. Now, did the Slovak government of the day inquire where a foreign power was taking some of its citizens? To its shame, the Slovak government not only sought to defend its citizens, it is the only government under the control of the Nazis, and at the height of the Nazi Empire, they had a lot of Europe within their grasp. It was the only government that actually agreed to pay the Germans for each Jew who was deported from Slovakia, 500 Deutschmarks. And there was a proviso in the agreement that those Jews should not return to Slovakia. Now, you don't have to worry, though, that the Slovak government was out of pocket, because, of course, the Jews who were deported were only allowed to take one suitcase with a few belongings. So most of their possessions had to be left behind, and most importantly, their homes had to be left. Those all became property of the state and could be redistributed to other people. Now, as a last bit of background, I just want to talk a little bit about concentration camps and the different natures of camps. The Nazis, I should say, started to build concentration camps as soon as they came into power in 1933. So the first camps were in Germany. At the point of these camps, though, was to hold their political enemies and undesirable people, such as Jews and others that I've mentioned. Now, these were not death camps, although a lot of people died in them. But once the war had started, they started to build other types of camps. And they built slave labor camps, which does what it says on the tin. They realized that they could use the Jews, those who were old enough and strong enough for slave labor before they either died as slaves, or if they didn't, they ended up being shipped to another camp. They built, of course, the infamous death camps, of which the best known, because it was the largest, was Auschwitz. And I don't know if there's ever a precise figure on how many people died in Auschwitz, but I've seen figures of 1.1 to 1.5 million people. Now, the Jews were by far the largest group of people who died in Auschwitz, but there were something like 100,000 non-Jews killed there as well, which is hardly an insignificant number. And then there was another group of concentration camps which did exactly what the term says, concentrate people before they decided what they were going to do with them. And one such concentration camp was built in Czechoslovakia in the town of Theresienstadt, or Theresienstadt, which you can see near the border of Germany and Poland. And the reason that that was chosen to be a camp was that it had been built in the late 18th century as a military fortress town. And I have 2 slides just to show you, get a feel for this, that this is not your typical concentration camp, wooden barracks or whatever. This was a solid, properly built town. There were 5,000 to 6,000 people living in Theresienstadt when this decision was made. The Germans ordered them out and moved the Jews in. Now, it's a fluctuating population, of course, but at its height, there were almost 60,000 people living there. So a seriously overcrowded place, not quite the same as when it was a town. Nevertheless, because of its special nature, it came to play a special role for the Germans during the war. And I'll come to that just a little bit later. So having given you some background, let me tell you about what happened with my family and myself. And I'll start by getting the worst out front. Of my close family, which I consider direct descent or uncles, aunts, and cousins, a total of 9 members of my family died. They all died in Auschwitz. The oldest was my great-grandmother, my father's grandmother, who was 91 years old when she was deported. My father's 2 sisters, along with their husbands and daughters, they each had a daughter, were sent to Auschwitz. My cousin Judith was 15 years old when she was on the street and picked up by the German army and put on a train and deported. They obviously thought she was old enough to be treated like an adult. And when her parents discovered what had happened to her, they were so distraught, they volunteered to go on the next train to join her. Now, this was in 1942. You have to understand that no one knew about death camps. I'm sure my uncle and aunt realized that they were not volunteering to go on a picnic, that conditions wherever they were being sent would be very harsh. But no one dreamt of Auschwitz as a final stop. My cousin Miriam was 9 years old when she was deported together with her parents and one of her grandmothers, who was also my grandmother on my father's side. They were the only family members about whom we had eyewitness accounts of what actually happened once they reached Auschwitz. And the story we were told was that they were taken straight from the train to the gas chambers. But I don't know the other members of the family, what happened to them. The last member who died there was my other grandmother, my mother's mother. But other members of the family survived. So how did they survive? Well, some of them by getting out of Czechoslovakia while it was still possible. My mother's brother and sister both left in time. And one of my father's brothers went with his wife to Palestine, to what is now Israel, and in 1938, and emigrated there. My father's youngest brother and his wife survived by hiding with false identification papers. Everyone had to have ID papers, and they got obviously good enough forgery under which they were Aryans, and that they were managed to pull off the trick for over 6 years and survive in that way. And other members of the family, my parents, my sister, and myself, survived by what I can only call pure luck, as I will come to tell a bit more about. Now, I can't, unfortunately, say anything about what daily life was like during those 6 long years, because my parents really didn't talk about the Holocaust when I was growing up. My mother, I guess when she thought I was old enough, started to tell me a few stories, which I'm able to pass on. But these were specific stories. It wasn't talking about what life was like in general. But it doesn't take a great act of imagination to realize that they would have been living in fear every day. The only issue would have been one of survival. Now, my parents actually traveled to Palestine with my uncle and aunt in 1938, but my father made the mistake of choosing to return to Slovakia because he felt that it was his duty to be with the community in the time of trouble. Now, I can understand his mistake because in 1938, not even the Nazis had yet made the fateful decision that they would try to exterminate the Jewish people. At that stage, there was serious harassment of Jews. Some Jews were already being killed, but we hadn't arrived at what happened once the war had started. Now, another issue that people sometimes have asked me about is resistance. Didn't the Jews resist? And I understand when that question is put that way, that what they're talking about is armed resistance. Well, you have to understand a few things to understand why there weren't a lot of instances of armed resistance, although there were some. In the first place, we have a long history of persecution, and therefore a certain folk wisdom that comes down that says, as long as you're not unlucky to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, because in that case, nothing will help you. But as long as that's the case, if you can keep your head about you, the danger will pass, normality will return, if not here, somewhere else, but normal life will return. One lives with hope. And the Jewish people were living with hope. Furthermore, in Slovakia specifically, this was a civilian population living scattered amongst the rest of the population. They were not living in a ghetto. They had no weapons. They were living with their elderly relatives, with their children. They were not living near a friendly border where they could either try to escape or get weapons across. So armed resistance was very, very difficult, and if it was tried by the odd individual was of course just fatal for them. The best known case of armed resistance is the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and there were some other instances as well, but these were special circumstances. But there are other forms of resistance. I would suggest to you, for example, that although the Jewish children were not allowed to go to the schools anymore, the Jewish community tried its best to continue to educate them. Now, education, as you know, is not about today, it's about tomorrow. It's an act of faith about a better world in the future. And the Jewish community were saying, we believe, for whatever you say, we believe there is a future for our children, and we're going to educate them. And specifically in Slovakia, there was a small underground group of 9 Jews. It was an informal group who came to be known in the literature as a working group. They were led unofficially by 2 people, Rabbi Dov Weismandel and Gizzy Fleischman. And I have a picture of Gizzy Fleischman because to me, she is one of the unsung heroines of the war. Gizzy Fleischman had daughters living in Tel Aviv, and she had opportunity to go and join them, but she also made that decision that she felt it was her duty to stay with the Jewish community in their time of trouble. And in fact, in my researches, I found a letter she wrote to a daughter in 1943. I'd just like to read to you a tiny paragraph. Fate has willed us apart, yet the same fate has also willed that during the years of our people's greatest misery, your mother is fulfilling a great mission in order to ease this terrible suffering. If I survive this difficult period, I think I will be able to say that I have not lived in vain. In this spirit, you must bear the separation. The suffering of the people of Israel stands above any personal pain. It always pains me to have to say that in 1944, she was picked up and sent to Auschwitz with specific orders to be killed on arrival. But I do feel that she did not live in vain, that the work that she and the working group did saved many lives. Now, my father was one of the 7 other members on that group. Now, what did the working group manage? Its most important achievement was to stop the deportations for almost 2 years, from October 1942 to late September 1944. So how did they achieve that? By bribing the key German and Slovak officials involved, and particularly SS officer Dieter Wyslyceni, who officially was advisor to the Slovak government on Jewish matters, but really the man who was running the show on that side. He was one of the people who was successfully bribed. Now, having achieved that, Rabbi Weizmandel thought maybe this plan could be extended to all of Nazi territories in Europe. And a plan was proposed to Dieter Wyslyceni, which became known as the Europa Plan. And he took it to Berlin and came back saying, Berlin's ready to talk about it, but demanded a very large down payment in order to do so. And the working group tried to raise this funds, and I know that Gizzy Fleischmann traveled to Hungary. There was a much bigger Jewish community in Hungary than in Slovakia, and at that point in time, the Hungarian Jewish community was not yet under threat, although it subsequently was destroyed. But she could not raise the amount that had been required, and the plan was stillborn. Whether the Germans were ever negotiating in good faith is an open question mark. I doubt it very much, but in any case, that is what happened. Another thing that the working group achieved was to alert the outside world to the existence of death camps. Because in early 1944, 2 young Slovak Jews escaped from Auschwitz, made their way to Bratislava, and contacted someone in the working group. And they were then asked to produce as detailed a report as they could, including drawings of the layout of the place, of the camp. And this was smuggled to Switzerland, from where it was disseminated to the international press. And at that stage, the world learned about the existence of Auschwitz and of death camps. Now, there were a lot of people after the war who felt that perhaps the Allies should have bombed Auschwitz, or at least the tracks leading to Auschwitz, to save lives. I don't know the ins and outs of that story. I take in good faith the reply that was given by the Allies, that they felt the best way to save lives was to end the war as quickly as possible. But, now, specifically in terms of the family, one of the stories I want to tell you is in a book. This book was produced quite a few years after the end of the war. It's based on the diaries of a man who was also on the working group, but who died shortly after the end of the war in 1945. And his brother eventually brought out this book. And there are a couple of ministers in the Slovak government mentioned here, so I will just give a little background. It's interesting that in a such a highly anti-Semitic government as was there in Slovakia, there was a minister, Joseph Sivak, who was friendly to the Jews and who took risks in maintaining contacts with the working group and trying to help the Jewish community. I think we always talk about government sometimes as if it was a person, but we know from our own governments here that they are actually made up of a lot of people who don't necessarily share all ideas together. So Sivak was not anti-Semitic. The other man is Sano Mach. He was a minister of Interior. Now, on May 12th, orders were issued to arrest Dr. Winterstein and to transfer him and his family to a camp. We had neither rest nor repose until the darkness cleared somewhat. Joseph Sivak helped me solve the riddle of the warrant for Dr. Winterstein's arrest. The latter was born in Banovce, where President Tiso had his parish. And Tiso wished the Minister of Interior to explain to him how it was that this clever Jew was still living freely on the soil of Slovakia. Sano Mach immediately issued orders to put Winterstein and his entire family in a labor camp. Now, my father was tipped off, and he went into hiding, and the diaries picked up the story later on. I devoted the first workdays of July to canceling the arrest warrant against Winterstein, who has been in hiding for 2 months. This was an extremely difficult undertaking since a warrant for his arrest had been issued by the president himself, and only a person of ministerial rank could cancel this order. Sivak tried to do so a number of times, but without success. July 3rd, I appealed to him again. This time, I requested that he appeal directly to Tiso, since the person who issued the arrest warrant should be the person to rescind it. Sivak did so. The president did not promise to take specific action to help Winterstein, but indicated he would not take any measures against him or oppose his release. Thus, there was room for hope. And in fact, not long after that, the order was rescinded, and my father was able to come out of hiding. Now, I said that the deportations were halted for almost 2 years. Why did they start again? Well, in August 1944, there was a popular uprising against the Slovak government, and it took the German army to put down this rebellion. And the German took more direct control of the government at this stage. Tiso remained as a president, but the Germans were running Slovakia more directly now. Also, SS officer Wyslyceni had been moved by his boss, Adolf Eichmann, a man you may have heard of, to another country, and in his place, he had sent SS officer Alois Brummer, a die-hard anti-Semite, who announced on his arrival in Bratislava that it was a priority for him to rid Slovakia of all the remaining Jews. And one of the first orders was to concentrate the remaining Jews of Bratislava in selected apartment buildings to make it both easier to keep an eye on them, but also to take them to the train stations when there was a train available for deportation. Now, my parents and my sister were moved into a room in one of these buildings. My parents always had plans ready to go into hiding if necessary, and they planned the next day to put their plan into action. But the very first dawn that they were there, the building was surrounded by soldiers, and soldiers came into all the rooms and ordered everyone out. Now, my mother pleaded with the soldier who came into their room to leave my sister, who was 7 years old at the time, behind. She felt my sister had a better chance of survival if she was left behind than if she went to a camp with them. And to my great surprise, when I heard the story, not only did this soldier not tell her to shut up and get on with it, he just said, I have to go and ask my superior officer. And to my greater surprise, this officer actually showed some humanity because he agreed to my mother's request. And in fact, he went further. He said, who's going to look after the girl? We will leave the mother as well. So on that day, my father was deported, but my mother and sister were allowed to go. As the soldiers were leaving, one of them turned and said to them, we will catch you later. Nevertheless, that act of humanity, my sister felt, saved her life. Now, the same day, my mother and sister were on a tram going to the hiding place, and they were traveling with a very good friend of my father, Dr. Ernst Abeles, who was also a member of the working group. And my mother became very nervous about a German soldier who seemed to be staring at them. So she said, let's just get off at the next tram to get rid of him. But the soldier followed them. And now he came up to them and demanded to see their ID papers. And while Abeles was fumbling in his jacket to find his ID papers, my mother grabbed my sister's hand and said, run. And the two of them ran. And my sister, who only told me this a couple of years ago, said she looked behind her. And the soldier had a rifle, but he didn't try to shoot at them or anything. He just looked a bit bemused. And he obviously thought it was a family unit, because he said to Abeles, you better go join your wife and daughter. He also added those words, we will catch you later. But nevertheless, another act of humanity in that he allowed Abeles to go. So my mother and sister had two very close calls that day, but they managed to go into hiding in a bunker with Abeles and a group of other Jews. But their luck did run out, because a young woman in hiding with them wrote an indiscreet letter to her boyfriend, and that letter was intercepted by the Gestapo, and it led them to the hiding place, and this time there was no escape. Now this was roughly early December. It was very cold. My mother found herself in a very awkward position, because when my father had been in hiding, or other times away from home on working group business, he had written her some letters, but with strict instructions that those letters should be destroyed after she read them, because they contained incriminating material about the group. But my mother, out of sentimentality, afraid that she might not see her husband again, had kept those letters. But now that the German soldiers had caught her, she was terrified that the material would fall in their hands. She put the letter, she told me, under her sweater. She made her way to a stove that was in the middle of the room. And before the guards realized what she was doing, she had opened the stove and thrown the letters in. And they weren't able to save the letters. I believe they beat her, but the letters were burnt. My mother and sister were sent to Theresienstadt, and there they met up with my father. Now, Theresienstadt, as I said, was not a death camp. It was just a concentration camp. But nevertheless, conditions in the camp were so grim that almost a quarter of the Jews who were sent there died in Theresienstadt. They died mainly from malnutrition or disease, or a mix of those. If you have very little food and people are very weak, and there's serious overcrowding, and someone catches any disease, and that spreads through the community. So both of those were deadly. So life in the camp would have been extremely tough, but there were specific instances as well. On one instance, my father, there were specific orders for my father to be sent to Auschwitz, and he was taken to the train station to be put on a train. And as luck would have it, the secretary of the German commandant of the train station, who was a German woman, slave labor, recognized my father, and she pleaded with the commandant not to put him on the train, claiming that he was her fiancé. And yet again, another act of humanity, this commandant sent my father back to the camp. On another instance, my parents were told that there was going to be a special train to take Jewish leadership and their families to Switzerland. And they were, to say, apprehensive about this story. It seemed a bit far-fetched. But as I said to you, Theresienstadt played a special role during the war for the Germans because of how it was built. And that role was a picture to the outside world. The Germans allowed Red Cross, I think maybe it was 2 visits to Auschwitz, but in any case, there was 1 visit when my parents and sister were there. And for that visit, they made sure that Theresienstadt was not as seriously overcrowded as it was. But more importantly, they made it look like normal life was going on. They opened a bank with special Theresienstadt money, as if business was going on. They had a bakery baking bread. They had a stall in the central square handing out candies to the children. And the only thing I had ever learned from my sister until she spoke to me only a couple of years or so ago was that she had seen a most magical puppet show in Theresienstadt. This was all part of fooling the Swiss Red Cross that the Jewish people were not being so badly treated as rumor had it. And it worked. The Red Cross declared itself satisfied. But the silver lining for me was that while they were in the camp, someone asked them, someone Jewish asked them about the train that was supposed to take them to Switzerland. And they said they knew nothing about such train. And I assume they took up the matter with the Germans because it was never, in fact, mentioned again. Although subsequently, in material found after the war, there were only going to be trains to Auschwitz. I don't know why the Germans were playing this kind of game, but as I say, they were always trying to hide their game. Now, some other types of stories that came down from Theresienstadt. My mother said that one day volunteers were asked to go pick potatoes in the fields. Now, picking potatoes is hard physical work. My mother was a city girl. She was a lawyer now and used to working behind a desk. But she immediately volunteered and got a friend of hers to volunteer as well, because she said maybe there would be the chance to smuggle a potato or 2 for the family. And in the conditions of the camp, as I say, with food extremely scarce, a potato is actually worth more than its weight in gold. And my mother was able to smuggle a few potatoes doing that work. And a final story before I talk about myself. My sister told me that she was outside in the street in Theresienstadt when she saw a German uniform, and she knew this represented danger. But being a child, she looked down on her feet. She thought maybe he won't see her. You know, she couldn't see him. She said to me she wanted to sink into the ground. She just wanted to be invisible. But of course, he saw her, and he came up to her, and he patted her on the head, and he said, "Little girl, don't be afraid. I have a little daughter just like you." And on this occasion, there were no other words, just a pure act of humanity, and he walked away. And what about me? Well, I was born in Bratislava. I have a picture of Bratislava just to show you the Danube and the castle. There was, of course, no question of my mother being able to go to a hospital. So I was born at home, and I was a very difficult birth. The Jewish doctor who came to our house told my father that there was no chance of my mother surviving because she had lost so much blood. And of course, transfusions were totally out of the question. But we have different stories. My mother and I had different stories as to her survival. She ascribed her survival to eating any scrap of liver that she could lay her hands on and building up her blood supply. That was her view. My view of how she survived was sheer willpower. She was a very strong-willed person, and I think she was determined to survive, and survive she did. When I was a month old, my parents gave me away, or put me in the care of a non-Jewish couple. Now, they did so because, as I say, they always had a plan to go into hiding at the drop of a hat if necessary. They realized it was very difficult to do with a child. My mother told me it was difficult to explain to my sister why she had to be quiet when soldiers were carrying out a search nearby. But absolutely impossible to do with a baby. And in fact, in my research on the Holocaust, I came across a couple of instances where infants were accidentally smothered to death by people who were trying to keep them quiet while the search was going on. So my parents' solution was to put me in the care of an Aryan couple. And interestingly enough, ethnically, these were Sudeten Germans, but clearly people who did not buy into the Nazi ideology. Now, I don't know much about my time with this couple, but my sister tells me she and my parents came on a visit once, and she saw that this couple cared about me. They were trying to do their best to look after me properly, and they expressed, though, a worry that a German officer had moved in next door to them, and they were concerned that he might twig to the fact that they were hiding a Jewish child. If I'd been discovered, I would have been killed, but they would have been in serious trouble with the authorities as well. They were taking a risk in hiding me. Whatever the story is with this German officer, the fact that I'm standing here means that he either never twigged to the fact that I was Jewish, or he chose not to say. The only other story from my stay with him that came down to me was that in the summer of 1944, I would have probably been somewhere around 8, 9 months old. It was a very hot day. We were outside of Bratislava in the forest. I was with no clothes because it was so hot, and I was sitting in the dirt, playing in the dirt. When who came walking along through the forest was the wife and daughter of the commandant of Bratislava. And as we normally are attracted to babies and small children, they came up to me and cooed over me, apparently. Now, the mother would have realized I was a Jewish child, but again, the fact that I'm here means that she either had more humanity than her husband, or I don't know why, but I assume that's the reason that she did not denounce me. Now, Bratislava, or Slovakia, I should say, was liberated by the Russian soldiers and their allies rather than from the Western allies. And the couple who were looking after me were afraid that the Russian soldiers and the local population would take out their anger on all that they had suffered over the 6 years on the Sudeten Germans. And therefore, they decided that they would go to Germany. And they put me in the care of a local Slovak peasant woman. Unfortunately, we never discovered, my parents never discovered, what happened to this family. I would dearly have liked to thank them, of course. I can only hope that they were able to rebuild a life for themselves and led a good life subsequently, but I have no way of knowing. Now, I found myself for the final few months of the war in the care of this woman who turned out really had no desire to look after a small child. And so I was left in the crib, apparently, the whole time. I fell ill. I suffered from vomiting and diarrhea. And she discovered that a roll dipped in coffee stayed down. So this became my food. Now, my aunt, who was in hiding under false papers, was the person who came and collected me after the end of the war. She knew where I was. And she told me, I was 19 months old, that I couldn't walk, I couldn't stand. I didn't have a single word, and the only thing I ate was a roll dipped in coffee. In fact, that was my food for quite a while, as my mother, for years, slowly fought to expand my diet. Nevertheless, the fact remains that she took a risk in hiding me, and if I had knowledge of who she was, where she was, I would thank her as well. That is, after all, the most important thing, that she saved my life. Now, at the end of the war, Theresienstadt was not liberated till the very end of the war. And at that point, my parents and my sister were able to make their way back to Bratislava. I have no idea how long and how they did that journey. I mean, it was a time when hundreds of thousands of people, and probably millions, were moving around Europe, trying to get back to their homes. But eventually, they got back to Bratislava, and I was reunited with them. I was 19 months old, as I say, at that stage. So what was the situation at the end of the war? Of roughly 135,000 Jews just before the war, only a little over 1 in 5, something like 22%, survived. And the statistics for children who went to Theresienstadt is even starker. I mean, I came across a range of figures from 47 to 1,000 and a few. The most common figure, and the one that was in documentary films, was 150 children. So you may understand when, as a child, I was learning these things, I felt myself lucky. It's a strange word when so many members of my family had died and the family had gone through such difficult time. But I felt lucky in the fact that my parents and my sister were actually, had survived. Now life returned to some kind of normality in that my parents went back to being lawyers. My father went back to his passion, as I say, the welfare of the Jewish community. And top of the agenda then that he was dealing with was a very thorny issue of restitution of Jewish property to those Jews who had survived and come back. Very difficult issue. Now that returns us to some kind of normality, but you might wonder, what does such prolonged traumatic experience do to the family? And it's also an area that I find very difficult to answer because, as I say, my parents didn't really speak about our experiences, their experiences through the Holocaust, other than the few bits that they told, well, my mother told me. I only remember my father having one conversation with me where all he said was, the working group did whatever they could short of armed resistance, any idea, however crazy it was, that they thought might help to try to help the Jewish community. But they never spoke about it. I think they were protecting my sister and myself, but probably above all me, because they would know that I hadn't experienced it directly myself. I was too young, and they were sparing me, I think, the trauma, and they were focusing on the future. But as an adult, when I started to think about it and I look back, I thought, what a terrible burden my parents carried, and particularly my father. Here was a man who dedicated so much of his time to trying to help the Jewish community, yet he had not been able to save his own mother and grandmother and sisters and so on. You're probably familiar with survivor guilt. Very often it's a plane crash or an avalanche or a tsunami, whatever, where a lot of people die, but a few survive. And those survivors, for some reason, feel guilty about why did the other people die, why did they survive? And as a teenager, I had that about my two cousins. Why did they die and why did I survive? But it was a phase, and after I went through that phase, I basically thought that I personally had not been directly touched by the Holocaust. I didn't even recognize myself properly, I'd say, as a survivor. That was my parents, my sister, and a lot of other people. But of course, I was fooling myself. And I only discovered that some 13, 14 years ago when I was invited by my synagogue to do a reading at a Holocaust memorial event. I had never been to a Holocaust memorial event. I always avoided them, telling myself that it was not meant for me, really. I knew all about it. It was really for people who didn't know about it, or maybe people who had been traumatized, and it would be helpful. So to my surprise, though, in the middle of this reading, I suddenly broke down and started to cry uncontrollably without an idea what was happening to me at that stage. Of course, subsequently, when I thought about it, I realized that I had been fooling myself and thinking that I had not suffered any trauma myself from what had happened. How can you grow up in a family that had suffered such horrendous experiences and not pick up some of that trauma yourself? But I have to say that was a very cathartic experience. Quite frankly, I would never have been able to start to do these talks if I hadn't gone through that. Now I'm quite able to handle any questions people have about that time, the Holocaust, etc., without you worrying that it may touch some sensitivity or upset me and I'm going to break down in tears or whatever, because I assure you I'm fine. So thank you very much for listening to the story of my family, what happened to us. I would like to just quickly remind you that the fundamental reason why I decided I wanted to do these talks was a need to explain the dangers of extreme ideologies and of extreme hatreds. The differences between us, between different peoples, is actually much smaller than the things we all share together, but they become very magnified in our minds sometimes. And I don't think it's realistic to think we can get rid of prejudice per se. But I hope it's realistic that we can stop prejudice from becoming hatreds. So that's the main reason why I talk. There is a final slide I would like to show, because having spoken about the family, this is a picture of us by the Danube with that castle of Bratislava when I was about four years old. I'm not responsible for my little Lord Fauntleroy outfit, so apologies, but that's my parents, my sister, and myself. So thank you again for listening, and I would welcome very much any questions you may have, whatever the nature of them is. For me, that's the part that I can find interesting, so please, can I turn it over to you, although I will need help because I am not, my hearing is not that good, so I may need help from someone to hear the questions.
We're going to try.
So, can I turn it over to you?
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I'm a PhD student. I work about political apologies, about historical crimes like what you mentioned.
Right.
So, as a survivor of the Holocaust, first of all, I would like to ask to you how important it is an apology from the offensive country, and also, of course, I mean, no matter what the offensive country does, it's impossible to restore the pain.
Right.
So, but at least, what would you expect them to do to, so that, or perhaps like psychologically, you feel better? Or what?
That's a very, very interesting question, and I have to say that I feel Germany did what it could. As you say, they couldn't undo what was done. The only reparations they could come up with was money, to give survivors money. And in 1948, they passed a law, Wiedergutmachen, making good again, which tries to do that. And there were different payments depending on what happened to people. Now, of course, this was something that they had to have some control on, because otherwise everyone could just say whatever they wanted. So anyone having a claim had to take it to a court in Germany. Now, the interesting thing is that at the age of 6, when I was 6, we moved to Brazil, and I grew up in Brazil. But my mother, having a legal background, she became effectively a lawyer for Wiedergutmachen, for all those Jews who had come to Brazil and who wanted to put forward a case. They needed to have a lawyer put the case together and for it to be sent to a lawyer in Frankfurt who took it to a court in Germany. So my mother worked for a charity that did this work. And many of the Jews in Brazil were very poor. And in fact, the money they got from Germany helped their lives immeasurably. I feel that Germany is a fascinating study in showing how a totally dramatic change was possible. Not just an issue of the restitution for Jews, but that Germany became a genuine, vibrant democracy. It's a different country. Now, what can you expect? An apology, well, that is obviously clearly an apology, a recognition of what had been done. So I think survivors of anywhere, of anything of this nature, I would be looking, I think some recognition is probably the most important thing, more than anything, just a recognition of what they had gone through. I imagine that applies for the survivors of more recent genocides, which when I was young, we believed, or many of us believed, that the genocide, the Holocaust had so shocked the world that there would never be another genocide, and lo and behold, we then had Cambodia and Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur. So that didn't hold true. And that's why I think we actually have to work actively to stop such events and other man-made disasters that may not be genocides, but which are happening right now in the world as well.
Hi there.
Hi.
You talked early on that you wanted to talk a bit about the future. My question is, what do you think there is to feel hopeful about in the future, based on your experiences?
That's a really tough question because, again, when I was younger, I used to believe that the world was very slowly, but nevertheless slowly moving to a better world, with less hatred in the world, with less wars, etc. And I feel that the more recent times have shown that to be an illusion. We seem to be living today in a coarser world than it was 20 years ago or so, in a world where people seem ready to speak hatred openly in ways that they found impossible earlier on. But we have to live in hope. And I think, for me, the issue, as I say, is we can't think history is doing it. Oh, history is taking us. The march is happening. Progress. We will progress to this wonderful future. We must always be vigilant. We must always work for it. Each generation has to learn everything anew. So I fear that we are leaving for the young generations, for your generations and the younger people, a very tough world.
First of all, thank you for your speech and for sharing your story. I was wondering how was all the events has been faced in a school environment, because I guess you went to school with people who had a similar story of yours, and how did you face everything with your friends? How was the school?
The school environment, well, that's interesting because I didn't face school in Slovakia. I was 5 years old when we left Slovakia as refugees because my mother had said, you know, we've had the Nazis, now the communists, I want to leave. And I actually started school here in this country, in London. And of course, that wasn't a Holocaust, therefore the Holocaust wasn't there in the school. It wasn't an issue. What was an issue for me was that I was a foreigner, and children can be very cruel, and it was pretty tough. But it had nothing to do with the Holocaust or my being Jewish. And then I grew up in Brazil from the age of 6. And in Brazil, actually, interestingly, quite a tolerant society. And I didn't experience any issues growing up. So I was very fortunate.
Having lived in different countries, how would you, if you have any knowledge about this, how would you say different countries treat their education about the Holocaust? How do they remember the things? How do they present them to younger generations?
I actually have a problem in answering you because when I was younger, it wasn't really on my radar particularly. It wasn't on probably anyone's radar in terms of schools trying to educate people, etc. Because I think it was so fresh that you didn't have to do that. Everybody knew the story. With time, it's become more important that there's a formal process of trying to teach younger generations about it, because otherwise they have no knowledge of it. And I've been in this country since 1973, so I've not really experienced what what other countries are doing. It's changed here because when my children went to when my children went to school here, they weren't taught about the Holocaust. It wasn't a subject. They knew about it because of the family history. But now it's part of the curriculum of all schools. So it's changed, and I think part of it is a reflection that with time, unless you teach people, it simply be forgotten. Now, I don't know what's happening in other countries at this stage.
Hi, the first speaker spoke about fictional portrayals of the Holocaust. What are your opinions on these?
On fictional portrayals.
Yeah.
The work of a writer, a truly artistic writer, is try to put all of us, or the reader, in a position where they can understand what's happening or to their characters, or what's happening to the society, or whatever. It is maybe an impossible task to try to do that about something that's so enormous and so horrendous as well. But there are certainly books that I think are very powerful, that their bit of it can move people, can convey something of it to people. I think it's something has to be tried, has to be done. Otherwise, you can't just say, it's impossible, so let's not even talk about it, let's not write about it. It's better that people write about it. The writing that worries me is the denial, the fact that a whole industry has grown up of Holocaust denial. Now, that didn't exist when I was young. And I think it didn't exist when I was young because the Holocaust was too obvious to most people. But as time has gone on, it's become easier for deniers to put out their books, and people who have no other background read their books and say, oh, maybe I'm being fed a lot of lies. And that, of course, is very hurtful to survivors, and one has to fight against it.
Speaking at a general term, would you say the term genocide itself either helps or hinders victims of such catastrophes?
I'm not really in a position to know, because the word genocide, probably its more important area is law. That's where it has a consequence. If you call it an atrocity or you call it this or that, you can convey horror without necessarily the word genocide, but genocide does have legal implications. I think it's an important recognition, though, of a crime which is not just that one's killed a lot of people, of which there are other crimes that are not genocides where a lot of people are killed, but that there is an attempt to wipe out an entire community or people, or race, whatever. That is a special category. I don't think that the terrible things that happen to individuals is in itself different, because, as I say, if one reads some of the things that are happening in the world today, they're as terrible as anything that can be in terms of what has happened to some people, the terrible things that were done to them, and the terrible things their family and loved ones suffer. But it's a recognition of something above that, of a category so I think it's an important term. But on the other hand, one shouldn't say, oh, this is not a genocide, it's just a horrendous situation, and what a pity, 20,000 people died, but it's not a genocide. That doesn't make it okay, There is a function for the word genocide, though.
thank you for your speech first.
Welcome.
I wonder if you ever went to Germany since the end of Second World War, and if yes, if it was hard for you to go to the country of the perpetrators?
Right. Yes, I've been to Germany a couple of times. First of all, was it hard? I was lucky in that I grew up in a household that didn't teach me to hate. Because when you're young, you absorb whatever I think you get fed. And it would not be difficult, I guess, to have made me anti-German. But my parents didn't have any love for the Germans, but neither did they raise me in that hatred. And I had an uncle and aunt who survived by getting out in time, as I say. They survived because my uncle worked for a Czech company called Bata, made shoes, and he was sent to Egypt on their behalf. Now he and his wife, my aunt, were thrown out of Egypt by Nasser, and they decided to go to Frankfurt because that's where my uncle was from. So there you have, Jews going back to actually live there because they didn't really know where else. And I went to visit them when I was about 21. I've subsequently been to Germany again. I went to Berlin for the first time a couple of years ago. I have to say it's a wonderful city. It's a very young-feeling city. I can see why people fall in love with it. I think part of the message I would like to leave with people is the danger of big labels, labeling groups. I mean, that's what was done to the Jews. The Jews, this, that. Sure, amongst the Jews you may find a Jew who did something this or that, just as you can find it in any group. There were too many Germans, unfortunately, who followed Hitler. But there were an awful lot of Germans who didn't. There were Germans who died or ended up in concentration camps because they were against him. And also find it hard to judge probably a large group of Germans who really just wanted to get on with life, who are normal people like also us. I'm a music teacher in a little village. I'm not really a political person. But if I'm going to teach at the school, I've got to be a member of the party. So you've got a group of people like that. So I feel individuals have to be responsible for their actions. And those people who participated in the terrible acts that they were carried out, they are responsible for what they did. But there were many Germans who don't necessarily share it. And when it comes to a younger generation, they have they don't share it at all. I don't see why someone who was born after the war should be taxed as guilty for what had been done. They have the burden of making those payments to make restitution. But I don't think they, in my view, share the guilt. The guilt is of the perpetrator. That's my personal.
Yes, I've got a question about, you're talking about education and about recognition of atrocities, and I wanted to get your perspective on a particular atrocity or series of atrocities that happened on the other side of the planet during the Holocaust, or at a similar time in China, actually, at the hands of the Japanese Imperial Army. A lot of what happened actually is not learned by children in Japan. They're not covered in the textbooks, and this is partly because of far-right groups lobbying to keep it out of the textbooks and maintain a nationalist sort of stance on things.
Right.
I want to know what your personal opinion might be on that.
Well, as I said in answer to another question, I think one of the most important things that survivors are looking for is simply an acknowledgement of what they suffered. And I can't help thinking it's terribly sad that Japan has found it impossible to make that apology, to recognize some of the terrible things that were done. Now, I don't know the history well enough, but it seems there's enough evidence that there were a lot of atrocities carried out. And I do feel recognition would be important. And I can't help thinking would help the Japanese. But they don't need my advice.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, of course, to Uri.
Thank you.